Good morning. Good morning. We're enabling the waiting room. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. We're getting everybody in here. And we like to start right on time. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with Expert Reserve Services this morning. By being involved in this platform, you are authorizing permission for this to be videotaped and uploaded to our website for use of marketing materials. Addition, no reproduction or use of this video may be made without prior consent. Thank you everyone for being here this morning for our program, Structural and Non-Structural Reserves. It's course number CRS 9014. And our instructor today is Anastasia Kolodzik, President of Expert Reserve Services. Today's agenda, she's going to be featuring the following information: a brief history of the company, SB4D, Milestone Inspections, Structural Integrity Reserve Study information, and important association requirements. Today we had this program scheduled for 2 hours, but Anastasia believes it will end at about an hour with questions following. And please stick around to the end where our structural engineer, Nick Lopez, will be taking questions. If you have any questions, please go ahead and shoot them into the comment box. Just simply hit chat and send your question. Anastasia will address all the questions at the end if they haven't been addressed already. Additionally, I will be sending in the chat an email address for Jasmine, who is the contact at Expert Reserve Services that you'll contact to schedule a consultation for your association. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Anastasia. Anastasia, our exceptional president who oversees every aspect of our reserve study inspections, processing, and reports. Her unmatched attention to detail ensures seamless collaboration with clients, board members, managers, and partners, resulting in a reserve study that not only serves its purpose effectively, but also seamlessly aligns with budgets. Anastasia holds the prestigious Professional Reserve Analyst designation awarded by the esteemed Association of Reserve Analysts. In addition, she has obtained highly sought after Reserve Specialist designation granted by the Community Association Institute. Her expertise doesn't even end there. She's a very impressive woman. She is also a certified reserve study specialist, a Florida licensed community association manager, and a Florida State certified continuing education provider, which is what she's going to do today. I'll ask that everybody put themselves on mute so that we don't get feedback. And without any further ado, good morning, and let's welcome Anastasia.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Wow, what an introduction. That is fabulous. We at Expert Reserves, we take pride in our customer service and in connecting with the association and with the board members and managers to make sure everyone is on the same page. We will have our structural engineer at the end available for any questions that you have on milestones. He does not perform the SIRSs, but he does perform the milestones, and he is well versed in all of the requirements throughout Florida. One thing I do want to say is this is not a board education class. What we are presenting to you today is the same information that we present to the continuing education community managers that is it is required by the state and it is approved by the state. We feel this is very important to have the same information for the board members as we do for the CAMs, simply because everyone is on the same page and everyone has the same information and follows the same guidelines. So if you will bear with me just a moment, I am going to share my screen with you and we will get started. Can everyone see that? Diane, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure. All right. So, of course, we are going to be discussing reserves, structural and traditional. I hope you guys have had your coffee because this is not an exciting subject, but we're going to try to get through this without anybody falling asleep. All right, reserves and structural and traditional. Of course, everyone knows that in the past few years, we have experienced a change in the reserve study blueprint, if you will. Since the disaster in South Florida, we have experienced so many different things coming out of this to try to deter any future disasters from happening. It resulted in the creation of the SB 4D. That's the Senate Bill 4D that set forth new requirements for reserve studies and actually took the reserve study in the traditional sense as we know it and split it into two different things. Excuse me. One of them being the structural integrity reserve study. The other one, sorry, the other one being the milestone inspections. We still have the traditional reserve study, which we will go into the definitions of all of these later on in the presentation. And we will go through some important association requirements. So before Champlain Towers, the only other poured-in-place concrete building to have collapsed in the United States was in Miami, and that was in 1974. It was not as large of a disaster as the one we experienced lately. That also resulted in a 40-year recertification program in Dade County. Since then, a lot of the counties have have implemented this 40-year recertification, and then every 10 years after. Now, this is very similar to the milestone inspection that we're experiencing now. However, it is different. The Broward County adopted their similar 40-year recertification in 2006. That tells you how long it took for these qualifications to go through the channels. So when you hear, when the board members hear, oh, well, this is going to be changed and that's going to be changed, please make a note that it takes a while for things to change. It takes up to 5 to 7 years for it to even get into legislation. So the knee-jerk reaction that a lot of us have when we hear that the qualifications and the restrictions and requirements are going to change may not happen tomorrow. It probably happened in the next 5 to 10 years. What we're dealing with now is already in legislation with the SIRS and with the TRS and with the milestones. The 40, 50, 60-year recertification programs, again, are a separate thing. We do not have any of those recertification programs in northeastern Florida right now as we know of, other than the recertification that has to deal with the milestone. So let's start with traditional reserves. Traditional reserves is what we know as a reserve study right now. And this is set out for 2 stories or fewer homeowner reserve and homeowner associations. So 2 stories or fewer condo associations and homeowner associations will need a traditional reserve study. Now, this reserve study encompasses everything that the association is responsible for. So it is what you know as a reserve study as right now. Your roof, your paint, your pavement, if you have streets or parking areas, your recreational areas, remodeling of common areas, and that includes floor coverings, lighting, etc. Your fencing and your gates, your separate garages and carports, your signs for entrance, information, your pool signs that are required by your city code, your water features such as your fountains, your waterfalls, your ponds, and anything else, including doors and windows, if the association is responsible for it. Traditional reserves encompass everything that the association is responsible for. So if you have doors and windows that are owner responsibility, then you do not have to include them in your traditional reserves. Another thing that we've come in contact with.
I don't see it. Can you I told her.
Another
And
thing that we come in contact, I'm
Anastasia,
sorry, somebody is.
Anastasia, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt. If we can make sure that we're all on mute, please, we're getting a little bit of feedback here.
Yeah, sorry, that kind of distracted me a minute.
Yeah. And Anastasia, you may be able to mute everyone.
Oh yeah, I can do that. All right.
And then that way you can unmute when there's questions. That way
Okay.
we won't.
All right. Okay, so getting back to another thing that we have come in contact with for the larger homeowner associations is they have vehicles. Vehicles are an important part of your reserve study if the association owns them. Things like golf carts, work trucks, um, tractors, lawnmower equipment, anything that the association in the vehicle range is responsible for needs to be in your traditional reserve study because those can be some pretty high ticket items. Now let's go to the structural reserve study. The structural integrity reserve study is what was the result of SB 4D. It has changed just a slight bit since SB 4D because they came back with SB 154 and adjusted some of the items that were included in your structural integrity reserve study. Your items for now are roof, load-bearing walls, and other primary structures, fireproofing and fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing and exterior paint, and again, windows and doors if association responsibility. If they are owner responsibility, windows and doors do not have to be in your SIRS. Your common area windows and doors do have to be in your SIRS. If you are a tower and you have what we call a window wall in the entrance of your building, all of those windows need to be included in your SIRS. A lot of associations that are in that situation have the mindset that they need full replacement on those windows all at one time. That is not always the case. We always take this on a case-by-case basis. If your windows are sound and intact and they're good for 30 years, then that's going to be your useful life on those windows. We do not, and no one expects to replace all of those windows every 30 years. They're going to replace them on a case-by-case basis and on an as-needed basis, unless there's a disaster, and then that falls into the insurance. Another thing I wanted to clarify on the structural, load-bearing walls and other primary structures. If your building is sitting on top of a parking deck, if you have an underground parking garage, that parking garage is considered part of your structure. So that would need to be included in your structural integrity reserve study. If you have a third or fourth story pool in a larger building, that would have to be considered where it would normally not. That would have to be considered as part of your structure. And a lot of this is determined by the milestone inspection and in conjunction with the engineer that does your milestone. If there is no engineer available, that's why we have one on staff, is to guide and make sure that we include everything that is required in these structural integrity reserve studies. Plumbing systems. And of course, again, no one is going to rip out every piece of plumbing in a building at the same time and replace it. So these are kind of tricky. The plumbing systems, unless there is an immediate known need to replace stack pipes or drain pipes or something of that nature, plumbing is done on an allowance basis. Allowances are funds that are set aside for repair or partial replacement of a component in order to maintain the integrity of that system. Same thing with electrical systems. No one is going to rip out everything in the electrical system of a building at the same time and replace it. So electrical systems and plumbing are usually done on an allowance basis. And that is done with lots of conversations and lots of digging and research into the building and into the records that the association has in order to come up with the right figure. Now let's talk a little bit about fireproofing and fire protection systems. When this first happened, everyone that we service, the first thing they said was, well, we have a contract on our fire system. So we have monthly maintenance on our fire system. That's not what this is addressing. That, of course, goes into your operating budget, which is a total separate thing. Your fireproofing and fire protection systems is for replacement of equipment, not for monthly maintenance. If you have a fire pump, it is for the replacement or repair of that fire pump. If you do not have a fire pump and you have a backflow that you are responsible for, it is for replacement or repair of that backflow. If you do not have either one of those and you are simply working on extinguishers and sensors and alarms, then that's what this line would be for, is to replace those extinguishers, sensors, and alarms, not for the monthly maintenance. And of course, these figures will vary greatly. Now let's address the last bullet point. Any other items requiring repair or replacement that exceeds 10,000 and failure to replace or maintain negatively affects the above items as determined by the engineer or architect. So these items, if you are a sub-association and all you're responsible for is the building, your structural integrity reserve study is going to cover the building, but it's not going to cover something such as an elevator. So if the only other thing you have is an elevator, you can include that elevator in your structural integrity reserve study. Your structural reserve study has to be fully funded. And that's one of the things that you need to take in consideration when you start needing to add items to this study. Has to be fully funded. And let me explain fully funded. Fully funded means, in layman's terms, you have the funds you need when you need them. It is an amortization schedule. 100% funded means you have all the funds that you need as quickly as possible. The fully funded model is usually referred to as the pooled model. The 100% model is usually referred to as the component model or straight line. Straight line is a very unpopular method of accounting because the contributions are usually twice what the threshold or pooled model is. If you choose to put that elevator and its replacement into your structural, you will have to have it fully funded based on which model you use. Now we're going to look at a combo study. And this is a option that we came out with in the beginning when SB4D was first established. This combines a traditional and an SIRS study to formulate a complete study containing every component the association is responsible for. One of the mistakes that I've seen made a lot by the associations is they say, okay, we're only required to do an SIRS, so that's all we're going to do. So that includes your 8 items that is mandated by the state. But then that leaves out things such as your pool equipment, your interior finishes in your, say, your clubhouse and things of that nature that you will end up having to replace, and you won't be able to pull from the SIRS to replace these things. That's why we offer a combo, which is your traditional and your SIRS. This maximizes the budgeting power for the association, and it's also recommended to be updated annually. Now, we know that the SIRS is mandated to be done every 10 years. However, with the economy the way it's been and the inflation rate the way it's been, what you do for 2025 is not going to be valid for 2026 as far as the numbers because of the fluctuation in the economy. In order to combat this as best as you can, we offer annual updates. Any reserve company will offer annual updates. So you can be on top of your budget each year. Your requirements. The association must have an SIRS study at least every 10 years for each building on the condominium property that is 3 stories or higher. That means that you cannot, if you have 6 buildings, you have to have 6 different building entries. It has to be broken down by building. This is true with the milestones as well. Milestone inspections have to be broken down by building or they are not valid. There have been some incidences that we've run across in the last year where the buildings were not broken down in the reports, and the city and the state rejected these reports. And that's not something that we want to make a habit of. First off, there was no indication by the municipality that that's what they were looking for. So now that we know, just know that whoever you get to do your reports, if it is an SIRS or a milestone, it has to be broken down by building. Now, traditional reserve studies do not have to be broken down by building, but they can be if that's what you request. Before a developer turns over control of an association to the unit owners, they must have a structural integrity reserve study for each building on the condominium property that is 3 stories or higher. And that's the glitch, 3 stories or higher. One of the things that came up when SB 4D was enacted is, well, I have a townhome that has a garage under it, the garage, and then 2 stories above. Does that make it 3 stories? 3 stories above ground is 3 stories above ground, whether it's a garage, whether it's a storage building, and then the living quarters is on top. If it's 3 stories, it's 3 stories. All of this applies to associations existing on or before July 1st, 2022. This is for the SIRS. This is not for the milestones. Milestones have completely different qualifications. The SIRS, if your building was in operation July 1st of 2022 or before, you need an SIRS if you are 3 stories or higher. The milestones have different qualifications, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. But keep in mind, your SIRS and your milestone are 2 completely separate things, 2 completely different reports. And your SIRS must be completed by December 31st, 2024. That's this year, guys. So if you haven't done it, you need to get on schedule to do it. Now, they did come back in the legislation this past time and extend this deadline in a way that if you are on schedule, if you are under contract for 2025 based on your budget year, then you are within the requirements. And that varies. So that's something that you need to research or give us a call, and we can help you figure out what you need to do about that situation. But it also states under no circumstances is the SIRS to be performed after December 31st, 2026. So that is the latest that you'll be able to do the SIRS. More requirements. Effective December 31st, 2024. Again, that is this year. Members of a unit owner controlled association may not vote to use reserve funds or any interest occurring thereon that is reserved for items listed in the SIRS for any other purpose other than intended purpose. Pooled reserves are allowed for SIRS studies. What this means in a nutshell is 2 reports, 2 completely separate reserve accounts, 1 SIRS, 1 traditional. Now, this can be done internally or it can be done physically at the bank. Either way, as long as it is separated. Because your SIRS has to be fully funded. The funds cannot be transferred over to your traditional or the other way around. You can't move from traditional to SIRS, SIRS to traditional. Everything in the SIRS has to stay in the SIRS. And all the interest that is born from the SIRS account has to stay in the SIRS. So you can't take the interest and drop it into operating. You can't take the interest and drop it into traditional. Pooled reserves are allowed for either or. You can do a pooled method for your traditional, and you can do a pooled method for your SIRS. Also, if an association fails to complete an SIRS pursuant to this paragraph, such failure is a breach of an officer's and director's fiduciary relationship to the unit's owners. This lays responsibility on the board. If the board does not follow through, then they can be held liable. And in some cases, it can be held liable personally. In some cases, it can be held liable through the association. And I know that each one of you carry E&O insurance, but the E&O insurance is not going to take up for this because it would be considered neglect. So make sure that if you are under these requirements, you get on somebody's books to get this SIRS done. Required elements. In order to perform a structural integrity reserve study, an individual must hold an RS, PRA, be licensed structural engineer or architect to perform the visual inspection requirements. That means that for the site visit is what we call it, or the site inspection. I don't like using the word inspection because that's not really what it is. It's a site visit. It's a gathering of information. You have to have one of these 4 credentials or the report will not be valid. The study is required to include and state estimated useful life, remaining life, and the estimated current replacement cost. Now, this is where we get into all the variables. Yes, we have inflation. At this point, we are able to include inflation in both your reports. In the past, inflation has not been included. I personally never understood why. If you are basing your budget on today's factors for 10 years from now, in 10 years, your numbers are not going to be worth the paper they're written on. So to include inflation is actually going to give you a leg up. And there's so many different ways, and I won't get into that part. There's so many different ways you can include inflation. You can do it for all components. You can do it for just a few components, and you can pick from 0 to 100% how much you want to include your inflation. Another thing, and I wanted to mention this about the inflation, a sliding scale is also an option. Your sliding scale is going to give you current inflation, and then it's going to drop it down to normal inflation over the course of 5 to 6 years. That also gives you a better picture of what your component is going to require for replacement when the time comes. A reserve specialist, PRA or RS, to formulate all this information into a reserve study, identifying all information gathered during this physical inspection. That takes away the armchair quarterbacks of this industry. You have to have a designation in order to formulate an SIRS and for it to be valid. If your provider does not have one of these two designations, I would ask them to provide it, because that is going to make or break your report. And your result, fully funded reserves. That is the goal. We want to eliminate special assessments. We want to eliminate loans. We want to eliminate higher and higher and higher contributions each month. And we understand that until this point, a lot of associations have done the bare minimum. The bare minimum is not valid anymore. There has to be a scheduled budget in order to keep your reserves on a proper level and in order to fill the requirements for the state, for your city, for your county, wherever you're located. Some counties and some cities are implementing more stringent requirements for these SIRSs and these milestones. And again, that is done on a case-by-case basis, depending on where you're located. If we know for a fact that you have a different restriction or a different requirement in your location, we will let you know. Most of the more restrictive requirements are concentrated in South Florida right now, but they are slowly creeping up the coast. I know that Volusia County and Brevard County are looking at adjusting their requirements in order to fit what they think would be the safer bill. You'll also get a distinction between structural and non-structural reserves. Again, you have structural, you have non-structural. Non-structural is traditional, and that's the everything else report. One thing I failed to say earlier about your traditional reserves are not required to be fully funded or 100% funded. Your traditional reserves can be funded at the amount that the board chooses. We recommend that you fund them as much as you can to cut down on special assessments on that side of things. But the structural integrity reserve study, again, has to be fully funded to meet the requirements. You will also get proper planning for replacements and repairs. When we go onto a property and the manager says, well, we have a $300,000 plumbing project coming up in 2024 or 2025 in June, we're going to include that in your report. That is going to start the timeline over for those particular components. And once you start that timeline over, then your contributions are minimized. So if you've had things repaired or replaced within the last 2 or 3 years or 5 years, depending on what it is, that needs to be in your traditional or your structural report, because that's going to start the timeline over. All of these buildings that have just recently went through complete restoration, they're on the front end of their timeline. So they're in a good position. If you haven't had restoration, you haven't had anything done in your building, in the last 10 years, then that's going to put you closer to the end of your timeline, which means that obviously your association is going to experience a higher contribution rate. One of the largest benefits of doing all this and getting everything in place, even though it is required, is it's going to sustain your property values. I don't know if you guys have looked at the price of condos lately, but I was looking at one and it started out at $265,000. Oceanfront, 7th floor, beautiful condo. And I thought that was a good deal. I checked on the same exact condo unit yesterday, and it's down to $160,000. mainly because their contributions are in what we call the catch-up phase. And their contributions went up 140% over the last 2 years to their reserves because they need to have all this work done that they haven't done in the last 20 years. So that's something to think about when you go to figure these numbers and you decide that you're going to have to raise your contributions for reserves. It is going to sustain your property values. It's also going to expand your mortgage capabilities. Many banks, FHA, VA, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac will not write a mortgage unless you have proper reserves. And now, unless you have a structural integrity reserve study and a milestone if you're required. It's also going to lessen the risk of special assessments. Now, we all hate special assessments. We refer to them as the scarlet letter of the associations. No one wants to get the letter that says you got 30 days to come up with $30,000 for a special assessment. Nobody wants to send that letter either. Having these reports and having your reserves on both sides at the required amount is going to lessen that risk. Now, it's not going to completely eliminate them. We all know that there's no such thing as completely eliminating anything like that. But it is going to lessen the risk. It's also going to give you maintained properties. Everyone that lives in a condo association or a homeowners association in Florida enjoys the amenities. They enjoy the fact that there's beautiful ponds and there's a nice pool they can go to, and there's gyms and there's common areas that they can use. And this is going to help maintain these properties. Now we're going to get a little bit into the milestone inspections. Nick, would you like to take this from here?
Good morning. Thanks, Anastasia. Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Lopez. I'm with Expert Reserve Services. I'm the PE professional engineer on staff. And just to start my video before I continue
There
talking,
you are.
so you can see me. My apologies. Video is off. Milestones are required, and they are broken into two phases. Just to give an overview of the distinction between the two phases, essentially a design professional, an architect or engineer, is required to conduct a phase one inspection, and they're, according to the Florida statute, asked to look for significant structural deterioration. Those are the three words that the statute uses. When they're looking for that significant structural deterioration in their phase one inspection, they are looking for things that would, just by their visual observation, indicate the need for further investigation to understand the extent and nature of the identified condition. And then consequently, if there is a condition which is significant structural deterioration identified, need to trigger a phase two if that is identified. And in that phase two, there would be further investigations conducted to understand the extent, because, presumably in the visual only inspection of phase one, they may not have been able to see all that they needed to see to understand the full extent of the problem. And so that's why they call for a phase two, to see the full extent of any problem that they might discover. And the design professional, thanks for that comment, Samuel. He asked me, it might be worth clarifying that not all building types require a milestone. Correct. So milestones are applicable to threshold buildings, which are defined as 3 stories and above, or stories which are 50 feet and taller. There's actually one more criteria, which I forget at the moment, but it has to do with size and occupancy load. But I'll look it up and get back to you. But basically, for those buildings that do have to have a milestone and a phase one is conducted, and they find, let's say in our example, something that needs further investigation, with the phase two being conducted as a second inspection, the jurisdiction will ask you to repair the scope of work of the repair work that needs to be conducted that will be identified and established by the inspector, engineer, or architect to repair that condition before the phase two is closed out, with the permit process being applied for, the work being done and inspected, and the jurisdiction closing out your building permit. Thus concluding and satisfying that 10-year cycle milestone requirement for any repair work identified in phase one and phase two cumulatively to be fixed. And then your phase two having been completed, you're brought into compliance with the milestone requirement under Florida statute. And then from the date of that closeout, you have 10 more years before you're asked to do another milestone. So they're asked to do a milestone every 10 years. Another thing about, timeline, let me just pull up the statute, so I'll read it verbatim. Okay, I'm reading from Florida statutes website, leg.state.florida.us. Statute section 553.899. Again, 553.899. You can Google it. Paragraph 3A. As to your age of your building, if you're saying, how old is my building? When do I need to do a milestone? The jurisdiction should write you a letter, but if you want to do your own calculation for your building age, if the building reaches 30 years of age before July 1st, 2022, the building's initial milestone inspection must be performed by December 31st, 2024. So at the end of this calendar year, if your building has its 30th birthday party before July 1st, 2022, and if a building reaches 30 years of age on or after July 1st, 2022, and before December 31st, 2024, the end of this calendar year, the building's milestone inspection must be performed before December 31st, 2025. So they give you another calendar year. So that's the timeline of when your building will get in cycle. And again, it's when your building reaches the age of 30 years old, and they're required every 10 years thereafter. So 30, 40, 50, 60, and on. So in a nutshell, when your building's 30 years old and every 10 years thereafter, you have to have a milestone completed. Your jurisdiction should notify you in a written letter that that's coming due well in advance. And when a design professional in the state of Florida comes out, either architect or engineer, they will have a phase one, which I might give an example. They may very well say in phase one, hey, you're good. We don't see any significant structural deterioration. No phase two is required. I've done that in my examples, projects I've worked on before, and said that phase two is not required. Everything, and the standard review here is visual observation, right? So phase one is non-destructive testing. And in the Florida statute, the legislature, as it wrote the bill, put in phase two for the design professional for cost savings, obviously, to be as minimally invasive, but as extensive as necessary to identify the full scope of the condition, which would be identified as significant structural deterioration, so that they do capture the full extent of the repair that needs to be repaired. So that will establish the full scope of work for the repair that needs to be accomplished under phase 2. And by the way, they give you 6 months to accomplish the repairs under phase 2 before they ask you what your status is to consider giving you another 6 months to finish up those repairs, and so on until you finish your repairs. But ideally, you could permit and hire a contractor to do the work in 6 months or less, ideally. But in any case, when you finish that phase 2 in the building departments, then, satisfied with what the repairs have accomplished, then you have 10 more years until you have to do it again. So with that overview, I'll take any questions if you have any, or I'll turn it back over to Anastasia. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for that, Nick. Does anybody have any questions for Nick? Okay, so just in a nutshell, I wanted to say that the difference between the milestone and the SIRS is the milestone is the here and now. The SIRS, Structural Integrity Reserve Study, is your future planning. So milestone is now, SIRS is future. That is one great way to distinguish the two, because there's been a lot of confusion that the milestone and the SIRS are the same exact thing. One of the things that we see on the chat is Samuel Hart said funds may be moved if the owners have a majority vote as stated in their documents. Samuel, would you mind coming on and explaining what you are speaking of about that? Because there's been confusion about that as well.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hi, Anastasia. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to take everybody's time too much, but reserve funding can not only can it only be used for the proper purpose as stated, but if there are any changes to the use or if that funding is to be even moved, there must be a majority vote by the association, and typically that's explained in the association governing documents like the declaration, the bylaws, etc.
Are you speaking about structural integrity, or are you speaking about traditional?
So there's several discussions right now with this being somewhat a new topic, but there's no case law on it yet. It's coming,
Right.
I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
However, several attorneys I've talked with and done podcasts with, they have all agreed that there should be no restrictions on an association that has money in a traditional reserves fund from moving that to a SIRS account if the association agrees and votes by majority of the owners.
Okay, so it is our understanding, and like you said, there's no case law at this moment, and I am not an attorney. I have to make that very clear. But I do read this. I live, eat, and breathe this, so I can have the proper information. But from what we understand, in the beginning of the SIRS and the implementation of the SIRS, that the unit owners can vote to move funds from the traditional to the SIRS to get it started, so to speak. But once it is established, then funds cannot be commingled between the two.
Yes, and correct. And I'm not an attorney either.
Right.
I am a licensed CAM and a board member.
Okay.
But absolutely correct. No commingling. That still applies.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that. I just wanted to clarify that, because if anytime I feel like we have the wrong information, I'm going to ask. And, that's kind of our motto. You're more than welcome to ask any questions. And if we don't have the answer, we will find it for you, or we will be in the same aspect and look for it together. Because not everyone knows everything about everything, and everybody should, realize that. And this being so new, there are going to be a lot of glitches. There are going to be a lot of changes, and there's going to be a lot of individual applications, if you will, to it, because no two associations are exactly the same. There is no way Even if you have the same building built by the same contractor with the same floor plan and the same blueprint right next to each other, those associations are going to be different as far as their reserves because they're going to be replacing things on a different schedule. So if you have a sub-association of 12 buildings that are all built at the same time, each one of those 12 buildings reports going to be different. And that's how we approach these SERVs. Each building is different. Did anyone else have any questions? Now would be the time. Okay, so I guess everyone is satisfied with the information. If you have any other questions, you are more than welcome to call our office or send us an email. We'd be more than happy to come and present to your association, go over everything in person or on a Zoom meeting of your own. We're all in this together, and we just have to move forward with these new requirements and try to navigate this new blueprint. And I appreciate you all for joining us, and I hope you got a lot of good information out of this.
Thank you, Anastasia.
All right, everyone, have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Have a great
you.
day.